Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're going to talk about a short war that carried a very long warning. It happened in August 2008 in a small country in the South Caucasus called Georgia. At first, to many people around the world, it looked like a distant conflict in a place they did not know very well. But here's the thing: that 5 day war was not just about Georgia. It was a warning about Russia, about the future of Europe, and about what happens when old empires refuse to fully disappear. To understand this war, we have to begin with a map. Georgia sits between Russia and Turkey near the Black Sea, close to Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the wider Middle East. It is not a huge country, but its location makes it extremely important. Think about it this way: Georgia is like a bridge between Europe and Asia. Pipelines, trade routes, military interests, and political influence all pass through or around this region. So when Georgia moves closer to the west, Moscow does not see only one small neighbor making a choice. Russia sees a doorway opening right beside its southern border. And for Russia, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, that doorway felt dangerous. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many countries suddenly became independent. For Georgia, independence was a dream, but it was also a very difficult beginning. The new country was weak, the economy was unstable, and several regions had deep fears about Georgian nationalism. Two of those regions were Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Both had their own local identities, their own historical pain, and their own worries about being ruled from Tbilisi, Georgia's capital. In the early 1990s, wars broke out, and Georgia lost control over much of both regions. After that, these conflicts did not fully end. They became what people often call frozen conflicts. But honestly, that phrase can be misleading. A frozen conflict is not really frozen. It is more like a fire under the ground, quiet most of the time, but still hot enough to burn everything later. Russia became deeply involved in these regions. It sent peacekeepers, gave political support, handed out Russian passports, and slowly became the main outside power protecting them. To Georgia, this looked like Russia was keeping pieces of its country under control. To Russia, it was a way to keep influence in a former Soviet republic. And this is where the deeper story begins. Georgia wanted to become more independent, more Western, and more connected to Europe and the United States. Russia wanted Georgia to stay inside its sphere of influence. So the conflict was never only about South Ossetia or Abkhazia. It was also about a bigger question: who gets to decide the future of a small country, the people who live there, or the great power next door? In 2003, Georgia went through the Rose Revolution. A young and energetic leader, Mikhail Saakashvili, came to power with a promise to fight corruption and rebuild the state. He wanted Georgia to join NATO, move closer to Europe, and restore control over the breakaway regions. For many Georgians, this was about dignity. It was about saying, we are not just a former Soviet republic. We are a real country, and we have the right to choose our own path. But in Moscow, that same message sounded very different. Russia saw NATO moving closer and closer to its borders. It saw former Soviet states joining Western institutions, and it saw Georgia as a possible example for others, especially Ukraine. You know, this is one of the most important parts of the story. Great powers often say they care about stability, but many times what they really mean is control. Georgia's choice looked like freedom from Tbilisi, but from Moscow, it looked like a threat to Russian power. Then came April 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest. NATO said Georgia and Ukraine would one day become members, but there was a problem. NATO gave them a promise, but not real protection. Georgia was encouraged. Russia was alarmed, and the West was divided. That created a dangerous middle space. Georgia was close enough to NATO to anger Russia, but not close enough to be defended by NATO. And when countries live in that kind of gray zone, history can become very unforgiving. During the summer of 2008, tensions around South Ossetia grew worse. There were shootings, accusations, explosions, and military movements. Each side blamed the other. Georgia believed Russia and South Ossetian forces were provoking it. Russia claimed it was protecting people in South Ossetia, including many who had Russian passports. And South Ossetian leaders feared Georgia would try to take the region back by force. The atmosphere became tense, emotional, and dangerous. Then, on the night of August 7th into August 8th, the fighting exploded around Tiskin Valley, the capital of South Ossetia. Georgian forces attacked the city, saying they were responding to attacks and trying to restore order. Russia responded with overwhelming force. Russian troops moved through the Roki Tunnel, a key route through the mountains from Russia into South Ossetia. Russian aircraft struck Georgian targets. Russian ground forces pushed beyond South Ossetia, deeper into Georgian territory. Very quickly, this was no longer just a local battle. It became a direct war between Russia and Georgia. And the balance of power was not even close. Georgia had a small military, trained and modernized in parts, but still small. Russia had a much larger army, more aircraft, more armor, and far more ability to escalate. So the message was brutal and simple. Georgia could start a move, but Russia could decide how big the war became. That is called escalation dominance. And in 2008, Russia showed it very clearly. The war also spread toward Abkhazia, where Russian-backed forces moved against Georgian positions. Russian forces entered areas beyond the disputed regions, including near the city of Gori. For Georgians, this was terrifying. This was not just a border crisis anymore. It felt like the country itself was being punished, and that word punished matters, because Russia was not only trying to win a battlefield, it was trying to send a political message. The message was, if you move too far toward the West, there will be a price. The West reacted with anger and concern. The United States supported Georgia diplomatically. European leaders called for a ceasefire. France, which held the European Union presidency at the time, helped broker a 6-point ceasefire plan. But here's the painful truth. The West could condemn the war, but it could not easily reverse the result. Georgia was not a NATO member. No Western country was ready to fight Russia directly over South Ossetia. So Russia learned something important. If a war is fast enough, limited enough, and confusing enough, it can create facts on the ground before diplomacy catches up. After the fighting stopped, Russia recognized Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent states. Most of the world did not accept that. Most countries continued to see both regions as part of Georgia. But on the ground, the reality had changed. Russian power was now even more deeply rooted there. For Georgia, the war left wounds that never fully healed. People were displaced, villages were damaged, families were separated by new lines of control. And the dream of quickly restoring territorial integrity became much harder. But the meaning of the war did not stop at Georgia's borders. This is why 2008 matters so much. It showed a pattern that the world would see again. First, Russia supports a separatist region or a disputed political space. Then it gives passports, protection, media support, and security backing. Then, if the central government moves against that region, Russia says it must defend people there. And then military force becomes a tool for changing political reality. Of course, Georgia in 2008 was not the same as Ukraine later. History never repeats itself perfectly, but it does create patterns. And when you look at Crimea in 2014, Eastern Ukraine after that, and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the shadow of Georgia is hard to ignore. The same themes appear again and again. Russian protection claims, Western hesitation, gray zones, fast military action, and the use of local conflict to challenge the wider European order. So the 2008 war was not just a warning about Georgia. It was a warning about how Russia understood power. To Moscow, borders could be pressured, sovereignty could be limited, and Western promises could be tested. For small countries near Russia, that lesson was frightening because it meant independence did not only depend on flags, elections, and international recognition. It also depended on whether a country could survive pressure from a much larger neighbor. That is the small state dilemma. Georgia wanted freedom to choose its future. Russia wanted a buffer zone. The West wanted influence without direct war. And those three goals could not easily live together. What makes the story even more tragic is that many people did notice the warning. Analysts, diplomats, and leaders saw that Russia had crossed a major line, but after some time, the world moved on. Relations with Russia continued in many areas. Business continued. Energy ties continued. And the war became, for many people, a sad but distant event. But for Georgia, it was never distant. And for Russia, it may have looked like proof that force could work. That is the uncomfortable lesson. when aggression succeeds, even partly, it can teach the aggressor to try again. And when warnings are ignored, they often return later in a much larger form. So when we look back at Georgia in 2008, we should not see only a small war in the Caucasus. We should see a turning point. It was one of the first clear signs that the post-Cold War peace in Europe was weaker than many people believed. It showed that frozen conflicts could become weapons. It showed that promises without protection can create danger. And it showed that Russia's next move would come where the map was uncertain, where identity was divided, and where the West was unsure how far it would go. In the end, Georgia in 2008 was not only about the past, it was about the future arriving early. A short war in a small country gave the world a warning, but the world did not fully listen. And that may be the most important lesson of all. Thanks for listening. If this episode helped you understand the bigger picture, make sure to subscribe and stay with us for more stories about history, power, and the choices that shape our world.